parks. From Merseyside to Harrogate, from York to Tyneside. You know, the north has got some wonderful parks. This is Saltwell Park in Gateshead, which is a terrific park in my opinion. It's one of the best in the country. You know, 2 million people a year use this park. All of this space, all of this fun, all of this beauty, all of this stuff to do, and yet it's right in the middle of the town. How much must it be worth, this space? It doesn't bear thinking about, does it? Developers could build loads of apartments and shopping centres on here if they got their hands on it. Thank goodness they can't. The amazing thing is that every one of us who lives in a town or a city has got at least one park like this within hopping distance. They're everywhere. Do you know how many parks there are in the north, eh? There are 1 million. Actually, I made that up. I often make things up. But there are an extraordinary number of these wonderful, valuable, invaluable places. Where did they all come from? Who invented them? Where is the first one? Ah, there's nothing like a nice day out in the country. Actually, this is nothing like a nice day out in the country, because despite appearances, I'm not in the country at all, but right in the middle of Newcastle. The town centre is perhaps half a mile down that way. And my own house, which is well within the boundaries of the town, is, it's a mile or so over in this direction. I'm entirely surrounded by major roads, but I'm on a piece of land called the Town Moor. I'm also completely surrounded by cows, and unless my nose deceives me, by quite a lot of their droppings, which adds to the rural atmosphere. On the other hand, there's the odd jogger and cyclist. Slightly less of their droppings, I hope, but they provide evidence that this is indeed the town and not the country. This vast area of land is a sort of park, and it's belonged to the people of Newcastle since time immemorial. In fact, in the 13th century, 700 years ago, it was described as belonging to the townspeople time out of mind. And the king, who basically owned this piece of land, gave the people the right to do all sorts of things here. They could play games if they wanted, archery practice or skating in winter. They could do their washing out here and lay it out on the grass to dry. They could look for fuel, wood, it was still covered with trees until at least the 1600s, and coal. They could dig for coal, which they did lots of. In fact, the surface of the moor is absolutely littered with humps and bumps of abandoned pits, which didn't belong to the church like most medieval mines, or to rich chaps who were the other most likely owners, but to the town itself and the people in it, who were known as the Freemen of Newcastle. There is still a group of people in Newcastle with the title of Freemen, and they continue to exercise control over the moor. In particular, they still maintain the ancient right to keep cows out here, or should that be cattle? Anyway, they've been keeping cows out here for centuries, and, well, to show you why, I think we need to pop down to Newcastle proper. In the past, you see, Newcastle was a tightly packed medieval city with tiny, narrow streets surrounded by high city walls and gates which were firmly locked every night to keep not only the people inside but also their cows. There were lots of cows in Newcastle in those days, and other animals too, because a town like Newcastle needed to feed itself, and it wasn't safe to leave the animals outside the walls at night. So every morning the town's neat herd, a neat is an old-fashioned word for a cow, so you might call him a cowherd, would come out and blow his horn as a signal to the townsfolk that they could take their cattle back out onto the moor. And here they are still, a park full of cows right in the middle of the town. They often worry me, actually, because not only are they exceedingly prolific pooers, do you know, I step in the stuff constantly. I often arrive at meetings ponging to high heaven, but they're also very curious, or aggressive, I'm never sure which, but they come charging up to you in a most unnerving manner. I shout at them and wave my arms in the air, so my walks across the moor can leave me looking like an absolute dooley, flapping my arms like an eagle and leaping merrily from cowpat to cowpat. But I like it nevertheless, a local tradition, something that's been going on for hundreds of years out here. Lots of towns had spaces like this which belonged to the lord of the manor or to the corporation, and upon which the townspeople had the right to disport themselves. Newcastle's is only unusual because it happens to have survived in more or less its original form, and still to be put to more or less its original uses, especially in June when the hoppings are on, Europe's largest travelling fair. Fairgrounds are all very well, but at them, I believe, one has to mingle rather too much with the common people. How much nicer to stroll surrounded by polite society. Oh, get him. You see, common fields like Newcastle's town moor were for everybody, rich and poor alike. But in the 18th century, the North towns began to see a new form of recreational facility, the public walk. This one's at York, and it's known as the New Walk, and it was laid out by the town corporation alongside the River Ouse in 1733. It was a sort of special park laid out solely for the use of posh people. Like me. The corporation laid it out along the riverbank here and planted it with rows of nice trees, presumably to provide shade against the pitiless heat of the northern sun. And they did it as part of a deliberate ploy to provide facilities which would attract the right sort of people to live in York. Like me. What posh people like him, or polite society as they like to call themselves, did here was to stroll in a social manner, to see and be seen. They loved nothing more than to dress up in their finery and parade up and down walks like these. You could talk to your family if there was nothing more to do, but you could do more exciting things too. You could bow to acquaintances. Or even better, you could sneakily give the eye to people that you fancied. It was a nice, safe way to eye up the opposite sex and spy out potential marriage partners. But apparently it wasn't always respectable, because it is said that from time to time naughty ladies used to mingle with the crowds. Ah, the old priestesses of Venus. Ah. But in the main, it was a very genteel and proper thing to do. If you go to Italy, the whole country seems to emerge for a stroll in the early evening, a stroll called the Passeggiata, and hundreds of people drift around the town, talking volubly, waving their arms in the air and eating ice creams. It's a lovely, lovely experience, and it used to happen here in the north, but we seem to have rather lost the habit for it. Not entirely, of course. We may not stroll in mass groups like we used to, but we still like to take the air on a pleasant evening. It may be less social than it was, but people are still out there, strolling and jogging, dog walking, cycling, generally keeping fit. They're just not quite as posh as the people who it was first laid out for. Except, of course, me. I'm in the world's first publicly funded park, the first park in the world to be paid for by the corporation of the town that it's in. There are some older parks. A few towns have got private parks to go with estates of posh houses that were built round about them. But this one was the first one to be built for the use of ordinary people and using public money. There have been hundreds and thousands of others since all over the world, and most of them, I have to tell you, were inspired at least partly by this one. Central Park in New York, for example, where I once went for a picnic, incidentally, only to find myself entirely surrounded by rats. But Central Park is one of the most famous parks in the world, one of the most interesting, actually, but it was inspired by here. Frederick Olmsted, Central Park's designer, came right here. I believe he came to this very rock on a fact-finding mission before embarking upon his own design. So where am I? I'm in the north, of course, northern England, but you knew that given that this programme's called Northern Pride. But which bit of the north has got the world's first public park? Birkenhead. Oh, that was my pitiful attempt at a Scouse accent. You probably thought it was Welsh. I hope I haven't caused anybody any offence, but this is indeed Birkenhead, just across the river from Liverpool, and this is indeed Birkenhead Park, the first public park in the world and a place of fantastic international significance. It was designed in 1843 and opened officially in 1847, and it was the work of one of the greatest landscape designers of all time. His name was Joseph Paxton. He'd been the head gardener at Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, and he went on to design the Crystal Palace in London. But this was his first public park, and he was very proud of it. He had a couple of assistants, one called Edward Kemp, who was responsible for the layout and the planting, and there was an architect who designed the entrance lodge and the bridges and the built bits of the park. He was called Lewis Hornblower, which is a splendid name in my opinion. There are no hornblowers in my telephone directory, and I think there should be. Where have all the hornblowers gone? He was a young man from Liverpool, and evidently Paxton wasn't all that impressed with his work, but I have to admit that it impresses me, so let's hear it for Lewis and the Hornblowers. I realise that what I haven't done yet is explain what caused people to build this park and why the first public park in the world should happen to be in the north of England. The problem was the working class. People in government were worried about the working class. They're revolting. They drink too much. Their housing is appalling.
Their health is even worse.
The population is increasing at an appalling rate.
The industrial towns are getting vaster and vaster.
The Select Committee on Public Walks, 1833, to consider the best means of obtaining open space in the vicinity of populous towns as public walks, places of exercise, calculated to promote the health of the inhabitants.
There was genuinely a real worry about the working class for all sorts of reasons. Worries about their health because of the growth of towns and the spread of poor housing. Desperate worries about the spread of diseases like cholera. And they were worried too about the morals of the working class, and especially because of the drink.
It's not just today that there are moral panics about binge drinking, because Victorian lads and lasses could suck it back like it was going out of fashion. And that's one of the main reasons why they built parks, to get the drinking classes out of the pubs and out into the fresh, nice, wholesome open air.
That's also why they provided tea rooms, to keep people off the hard stuff. You know, I love park tea rooms, but I think that this is probably my favourite. It's in the Valley Gardens at Harrogate. What a charmer. But to be honest, no more charming than the rest of this wonderful park.
I have come back to the northwest again. I have leapt across the River Mersey from Birkenhead in a single bound, and here I am at Sefton Park in Liverpool, where I want to pause for a moment and muse upon the design of parks. You see, when public parks were first invented, somebody had to decide what they were supposed to look like, and the inspiration that came to everybody's mind was the sort of park that had existed for centuries around country houses.
And that meant, first of all, a proper entrance lodge and gateway. Isn't that grand? I love that lodge. You could call that style a cottage ornate if you were in a bit of a poncy mood. A lovely, romantic, fantasy cottagey sort of style, as if it weren't in the middle of Liverpool but in some faraway rural idyll, surrounded by rosy-cheeked villagers instead of tough scousers. Spiffing gateway as well. And into the park, which has of course got what every country house park should have, and every Victorian urban park was given. There are always clumps of spreading trees with paths winding among them. There are wide spreading lawns for picnics and games. There has to be a serpentine lake.
Parks pretty well follow a pattern, but quite often you find something a bit special, and Sefton Park is no exception. Sefton Park has the Palm House. One of the driving forces in the creation of parks was the desire to improve the populace, to stuff a bit of education into them. It wasn't enough to come to the park to have fun, it had to do you good. So lots of parks got little zoos or botanical gardens or palm houses to add a bit of culture to the experience. This one even had art as well. improving statues of worthy subjects to enrich the mind.
It's a wonderful building, and yet no time ago it was a scabby shell, unloved and vandalised. 1992 was when they started trying to get it saved. You just can't believe the past, can you? I mean, how could anybody vandalise this wonderful building? How could we as a nation let it get into that sort of state? And yet it happened everywhere.
Of course, it had always gone on. I read an entry in the minutes of one park committee complaining about gangs of teenage boys sitting on the terrace, swearing and making lewd comments at ladies walking by, and that was in the 1880s. But of course, it got worse, so that by the 1980s and 90s, parks all over the north were decaying and dangerous and run down. But since then, there has been the most fantastic renaissance.
Parks have had voluntary groups and friends groups working for them. Councils have applied for heritage lottery grants. This park has had a £4.7 million restoration recently, and of course it shows. And of course it's happened everywhere. Birkenhead has had £11.5 million spent on it. Saltwell Park in Gateshead has been transformed. All over the north, these wonderful Victorian masterpieces have re-emerged from the gloom into full resplendent glory. This is my park. My house is just 100 yards along there. It's another of those parks that's never, ever been better. It used to be scabby, but now it's great, and as a result, people love it. Sometimes you can hardly get into it, it's so busy.
I bet you're thinking right now, that Grundy, he has got no taste in parks. He should have come to ours. But you see, that's the problem. When you've got the whole north to look at, there's so much that's nice that you're bound to miss things out.